Sara and Tim lived in a small house on the edge of a quiet village. The house was made of wood, and its roof was covered with straw. It wasn't a grand house, but it was their home, and it had always been enough. Inside, there was a small kitchen with an old stove where their mother cooked meals. There was a wooden table where they ate their dinners together, and a fireplace that kept them warm during the cold months. It was cozy, but recently things had begun to change. Sara, the older of the two children, was 14 years old. She had long, dark brown hair that fell in loose waves down her back. Her eyes were kind and full of worry as she looked at the empty shelves in the kitchen. For months, their family had struggled. Her father, once a proud factory worker, had lost his job when the factory closed down. He would leave early every morning, his face tense with worry, hoping that today would be the day he found something to help them. But no matter how hard he tried, there were no jobs to be found in the village. The work simply wasn't there anymore. Her mother had been very ill for several months now. She lay in bed most of the day, unable to care for herself. Her face was pale, and every time Sara went to check on her, she could hear her mother coughing weakly in the other room. Their home had once been filled with the sound of her mother singing and the warmth of her laughter, but now it felt quieter. Everything was changing, and it scared Sara. Tim, her little brother, was only 6 years old. He had big, round eyes that always seemed full of curiosity, and his messy brown hair often stuck out in all directions. He was full of questions, always asking about the world around him. Despite the difficult times, Tim never seemed to lose his energy. He would run around the house, playing with his small wooden toys, unaware of how hard things had become. One morning, Sara stood in front of the cupboard, trying to figure out what to make for breakfast. When she opened it, she saw that the shelves were nearly bare. There was only a small loaf of bread left, and the milk was almost gone. Her stomach sank as she stared at the empty space. She didn't know how they were going to make it through the next few days. She heard Tim's small voice behind her. "Sara, what are we having for breakfast today?" Sara turned around and forced a smile. "We're having bread, Tim," she said, trying to sound cheerful. "We'll make it last for a little while." Tim's face lit up. "Just bread?" he asked, surprised. "That's okay. Bread is good." Sara smiled at him, but inside, she felt a knot of worry. She knew that bread wouldn't be enough to keep them going for much longer. They needed more. But what could they do? Later that afternoon, their father came home. His face was even more tired than usual, and he had a heavy look in his eyes. He sat down at the table, his hands shaking slightly as he rested them there. "I've tried everything I can," he said quietly. "There's no work. The village is quiet. People are struggling, and I don't know what to do anymore. Sarah's heart tightened. She had been trying to hold things together, to keep the worry from showing, but now she couldn't pretend anymore. Their father was the rock of their family, but even he was starting to feel defeated. "Papa," Sarah said softly, walking over to him, "what do we do now?" Their father took a deep breath. "I think it's time for you two to go to the town," he said, his voice low. "Maybe someone there will be able to help us. The town is a long way off, but it's worth a try." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The thought of leaving her sick mother behind was almost too much to bear, but she knew they had no other choice. They needed food. They needed help. She looked at Tim, who was sitting quietly at the table, watching them with wide eyes. "I'll go," Sarah said after a moment, making up her mind. "But what about Mama? We can't just leave her." Their father reached out and gently placed his hand on Sarah's. "I'll take care of her," he said, his voice filled with a mix of sadness and love. "You two go. Find help. Find food. We'll make it through this." Tim, who had been listening quietly, suddenly looked up. "Sarah, are we going to the town?" Sarah nodded, her heart heavy. "Yes, Tim. We're going to the town. We'll find help." Tim smiled brightly, though Sarah could see the worry in his eyes. He was still so young, and he didn't yet fully understand how serious things were. But Sarah did, and she knew she had to be strong for both of them. The next morning, the sky was clear, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves in the trees. Sarah and Tim stood in front of their little house, ready to begin their journey. Their father had given them a small loaf of bread and a few coins. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. Sarah put her hand on Tim's shoulder as he tugged at her sleeve, looking up at her with his big eyes. "Do you think we'll find Mama some medicine in the town?" he asked, his voice full of hope. "I hope so, Tim," Sarah said, giving him a reassuring smile. "We'll do our best to find something for her." Their father kissed them both goodbye, his voice soft, but filled with love. "Be brave, my children," he said, holding them both in his arms. "I know you can do this. Look after each other." Sarah tried to smile back, but her heart was heavy. She felt as though they were leaving a piece of themselves behind, but she knew they couldn't stay. The road to the town was long and difficult, and there was no time to waste. They set off down the dirt road, their feet crunching on the dry ground as they walked. The trees on either side of them stretched tall and silent, the only sound the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustling of leaves. The road seemed endless, and Sarah could feel the weight of their journey pressing on her. "I'm getting tired," Tim said after a while, his small legs already starting to ache. Sara looked down at her little brother, his face red from the heat. "We'll take a break soon, Tim," she said. "Just a little further." As they continued, Sarah's mind kept wandering back to their mother. She could hear her mother's weak cough echoing in her ears, and it made her feel even more determined to get help. She couldn't imagine leaving her alone like this, but what choice did they have? They had to find a way to survive. After walking for what felt like hours, Sara and Tim found a shaded spot by the side of the road and sat down to rest. Tim pulled out the small loaf of bread, and they each had a small piece. They couldn't eat too much, as they had to make it last. "I miss Mama," Tim said, his voice quiet. "When will we be back?" Sara looked at her little brother, his face filled with worry. "Soon, Tim. We'll be back soon, and we'll make Mama better." She tried to sound confident, but inside, she wasn't so sure. The journey to the town was long, and the path was unfamiliar. But Sara had to believe that they would make it. She had to be strong for Tim. The next day, the sun was shining brightly as they resumed their journey. The road ahead of them seemed endless, winding through fields and past small farms. Sara's feet were sore, and Tim's small legs were struggling to keep up. As they walked, Tim began to ask his usual questions. "Where do you think the town is, Sara?" he asked, his voice full of curiosity. "Do you think there will be lots of people there?" Sara smiled at him, though she could feel the worry starting to creep in. "I don't know, Tim. I've never been to the town before, but I'm sure we'll find our way." The road became harder to walk as the day wore on. The sun was high in the sky now, and the heat made everything feel even more difficult. Tim's small hand gripped hers tightly, and Sara could feel his fatigue in every step he took. "Are we almost there, Sara?" Tim asked, his voice full of hope. "I don't know," she said, looking around. "It's hard to say, but we'll keep walking. We have to." They continued, the road stretching on and on. The fields around them were empty, and there were no houses in sight. It was as though they were the only two people in the world. As they walked, Tim spotted something in the distance. "Look, Sara," he said, pointing. "A butterfly." Sara smiled at her little brother's excitement. Even in the middle of their struggle, Tim still managed to find wonder in the small things. She followed his finger and saw the butterfly fluttering by. It was small and delicate, its wings bright yellow with black spots. "Look at that," Sara said softly. "It's beautiful." Tim smiled and watched the butterfly for a moment before turning back to her. "Do you think we'll see more butterflies in the town?" Sara chuckled softly. "Maybe, Tim. Maybe we will." For a moment, the weight of the journey didn't seem so heavy. The butterfly, simple as it was, had reminded Sara that even in the hardest times, there was beauty in the world. By late afternoon, Sara and Tim were exhausted. The road had seemed to stretch endlessly in front of them, and the sun was beginning to set. Tim's feet were covered in dust, and he was starting to drag behind. "We need to rest, Tim," Sara said gently. "Let's find somewhere to stop." As they continued walking, they saw a small house off to the side of the road. It looked cozy, with a thatched roof and flowers growing around the windows. The smoke rising from the chimney made Sara's stomach growl with hunger. An old woman was sitting on the porch, knitting a scarf. She looked up when she saw Sara and Tim walking toward her. Well, what do we have here?" she said, her voice kind and warm. "You two look like you've been walking all day. Come in. You must be hungry." Sara hesitated for a moment. They had been walking for hours, and they were both tired and hungry. But she didn't want to impose on the kind woman. Still, it had been a long day, and they needed food and rest. "Thank you," Sara said politely, her voice soft. "We are hungry." The woman smiled warmly and stood up. "Come inside. I have some soup and bread. It's not much, but it's better than nothing." The inside of the house was small, but cozy. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, and the smell of soup filled the air. The woman gave them bowls of soup and slices of fresh bread. They ate quickly, savoring each bite. For the first time in what felt like forever, they didn't have to worry about where their next meal would come from. When they finished, the woman smiled at them. "You're on your way to the town, aren't you?" she asked. "The road is long, but there's a shortcut through the field. It will take you there faster, but you have to be careful. It's not always safe." Sara felt a little uneasy. The idea of taking a shortcut was tempting, but she wasn't sure what dangers might lie ahead. Still, they had to move quickly. Time was running out. "Thank you," Sara said, looking at Tim. "We'll take the shortcut." The woman nodded, her face kind but serious. "Be careful, children, and take this blanket," she added, handing them a warm, thick blanket. "It will keep you warm." Sara and Tim thanked the woman, feeling a little more hopeful as they set off toward the shortcut. The path ahead seemed more uncertain, but they had no choice but to keep going. The next morning, Sara and Tim woke up early. The sky was bright and clear, with only a few clouds floating lazily across the blue. After a quick breakfast of the last pieces of bread, they began to walk again, heading toward the field the old woman had told them about. The field stretched out in front of them, wide and open. The tall grass swayed in the wind, and Sara could feel the cool breeze against her face. It was a beautiful sight, but the journey still weighed heavily on her shoulders. They were getting closer to the town, but they were also unsure of what awaited them there. "This path is pretty," Tim said, running ahead of Sara. He was full of energy, even though they were both so tired. "Do you think we'll see more butterflies, Sara?" Sara smiled, though her heart still felt heavy. "Maybe, Tim. Maybe we will." The grass grew taller as they walked, and soon they were surrounded by it. The path was narrow, and they had to push through the thick grass to move forward. The sounds of the world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the rustling of the grass and the occasional bird chirping in the distance. After a while, the path became harder to follow. It twisted and turned, and Sara wasn't sure which way to go. She tried to stay calm, but she could feel the panic rising in her chest. They had to keep going. They couldn't turn back now. "Do you think we're lost?" Tim asked, his voice quiet. He had stopped running ahead and was now walking beside her, his small hand clutching hers tightly. "I don't think so," Sara said, trying to sound confident. "But we have to be careful. Stay close, Tim. We don't want to get too far off the path." The wind picked up, and the tall grass began to bend and sway more quickly. It felt as though something was moving through the field. But when Sara looked around, she couldn't see anything. Suddenly, there was a loud rustling behind them. Sara spun around quickly, her heart racing. But when she looked, there was nothing there. Just the tall grass moving in the wind. She felt a cold chill run down her spine. "What was that?" Tim whispered, looking up at her with wide eyes. "I don't know," Sara said, her voice tight with worry. "But let's keep moving." They walked faster now, their steps quick and cautious. Sara kept her eyes on the path ahead, her heart pounding. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but she didn't want to scare Tim. As they moved deeper into the field, the sky began to change. The bright blue sky turned gray, and the wind picked up even more, causing the grass to bend low. The air grew cooler, and Sara wrapped the blanket the old woman had given them around her shoulders. Tim tugged on her sleeve. "Sara, look," he said, pointing ahead. "I think I see the town." Sara looked up, and sure enough, in the distance, she could see the buildings of the town beginning to appear. She felt a surge of relief, but the unease in her chest didn't fade. They had made it through the field, but what awaited them in the town? "Let's keep going," Sara said, trying to sound calm. She didn't want Tim to feel scared, even though she was scared herself. "We're almost there." Now, from this point, the story will be continued in the next part.